Swedish Terapeut here. We are in the Uglibo, which is Swedish for the owl's nest. And I just got done seeing a client. But I got so hot yesterday in our green room in our house where all the tomatoes are. So you saw that yesterday on July 5th. And today is July 6th. And it is Dr. Sally's birthday. So happy birthday, Dr. Sally. I hope that you get to see this video because this is Swedish Terapeut and you know me by a different name. And you know my mom. I just have to say hello and wish you a happy 94th birthday. So I would like to tell those watching Swedish Terapeut a little bit about you. So I hope this doesn't embarrass you. Let's go see what I put together, okay? Okay. So we're gonna share the screen. And I have a small presentation. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So, dear young people and common folk, you deserve to know Dr. Sally. And this is actually in between the Vätska 1, part 1, and the Vätska part 2. And as we've talked about, Vätska is a Swedish word for fluid or the wet stuff. We'll come to why I've put Dr. Sally in between the Vätska 1, part 1, and Vätska part 2. But basically, it is her birthday. So happy birthday, 94th birthday, Dr. Sally. And I believe you were born in 1927. So if my math is all correct, then you are 94 today. So, dear young people and common folk, you deserve to know a short story about Dr. Sally. Now, it is Sarah E. Sutton, E for Esther, her mom. But as I come to find out after getting to know her, that she preferred Dr. Sally and Sally, not Sarah. So before we've talked about how storytelling helps with neural entrainment. So we get a message to sink in when we couple. And when you can listen to my voice and I can tell you a story, then it's a lot easier to remember. And you don't have to remember all the details, but you'll be able to take away bits and pieces that are important to you. And so we've talked before about blending, and then we've talked about blurring. And if boundaries blur, then we lose our state of integral grit. If boundaries blend, that means that they mix in a certain ratio, almost like a baking recipe. You have to have the right amount of salt, you have to have the right amount of flour, you have to have the right amount of sugar. Otherwise, you're going to make something entirely different than a loaf of bread. So here's an awkward thought. My mom in this picture was 74 years old. At this picture time in the summer of 2014, Dr. Sally, who made us this gorgeous papaya, I think it was, mango salad. That's right, mango. Dr. Sally could cook. So she made this mango salad, and my mom, 74, was probably at the best time of her life in the summer of 2014. Long story, but I won't go there because this is about Dr. Sally. Dr. Sally was 87, and this is me, 42, and that's my mom again. And you can see that she is happy. Unfortunately, here you didn't see her so happy, but she does smile in 2014. So what blurred in my mom for her to lose her state of integral grit? being 80 years old now, and she could no longer adapt now. And then we have Dr. Sally, who at this time was 87 and who's now 94. And I don't know how Dr. Sally is doing, but I know that she still likes to cook and eat and write stories because she likes to tell stories. And she's a very good storyteller. So Dr. Sally had a lot of issues going on because she ran a full medical practice all by herself. And yes, she had some help, and she found some wonderful people to help her. And but her integrity, it stayed intact. How did she keep her integrity intact despite a stressful life, a stressful profession, despite poor sleep routines, despite open heart surgery, despite falls, despite broken bones, despite breast cancer treatment of all things? And that was in her later years, in her late 80s. And then there's another car accident, and there's more broken bones. And so, how does one keep on going? Our body is so incredible because it adapts. It it's not a car. It's not made of parts that have nothing to do with each other, or if one part goes bad, you can replace it. We're a whole. Um, so how did my mom lose the ability to adapt? I've always wanted to know that. Right now, she's in this 2021. She's not whole. She's my mom, but she's not my mom. So let's talk about Dr. Sally because this is better. Okay, dear young people and common folk, here is a short story about Dr. Sally. And I am going to read, okay, you can see here in the 1940 US Census of the household members, there was the father, and then there was Dr. Sally's mom, Esther, and there was somebody living there, and there was a son, Gerald, and then there was a daughter, Sarah, which is Dr. Sally, and then another daughter, Mary, and then a son, Craig. I thought it was Craig with a C. This one is spelled a little bit odd. Okay, so Dr. Sally's book, With and Without Sin. So it's important to know where she comes from. It's important to know her experiences because they matter, because it made the person that she is today. And it made the person that treated me from 2010 when I met her. And I had her treat my body in a way that no one else, no doctor had ever done. I was amazed at what she could do with her hands. She was always listening, but she was also always welcoming. And she was always fixing food, and she was always planning, and she was always inviting, and she was always improving others. And she took great care in that. So at the age of 10 or oh, you know what? We need to learn a little bit about Dr. Sally's experience. So I'm going to read from this. We spent a lot of vacations in Mitchellville with the grandparents. So it was easy to realize why there were so many recipes. She was talking about a recipe box that her grandma Craig had. Pop Craig, must be her grandpa, raised huge gardens that fed several families. When he came home from the elevator, a grain elevator, which he owned, he picked up his hoe and corn knife. After chopping corn stalks to feed the cows, he would milk the cow. From there, he headed to the garden to hoe weeds and harvest whatever vegetables might be needed for supper or the next day. He also raised chickens, which produced the fresh eggs we had for breakfast. We were always fascinated when he used the corn knife to chop off the heads of the spring fries and toss the chicken out into the yard. We watched them flop around the yard until they had bled out, and we got to help him dip them in boiling water so that the feathers would come off easily. Grandma Craig cleaned the chickens, fried them, and served them for dinner. I have included directions for frying chicken the way she did in this book. The rest of the meal came from the garden. It took most of the morning to prepare the vegetables. All the meals were from scratch. I don't recall ever seeing a can of mushroom soup, or tomato soup, or soup mixes, or cake mixes, or chocolate chips. So I've attempted to include relatively few recipes that use mixes, canned soup, but that has also been difficult to accomplish. She goes on to say, my grandparents were very hospitable, and Mary Craig never knew how many places to set at the table. She always prepared a huge pot of boiled potatoes with or without skins for the noon meal or dinner. The leftovers were always used for supper. If perchance there were enough potatoes left, she would prepare what I chose to call stretched potatoes. I've included her method for preparing in the vegetable section of this cookbook, the stretched potatoes. They are a favorite of all her grandchildren. All of these guys right here were her grandchildren. Yes. And when we meet in our homes for reunions, I occasionally prepare these. During my childhood, the only way we had to preserve food was canning until lockers became available to freeze meat. Vegetables and wonderful strawberries were always, sorry. During my childhood, the only way they had to preserve food was canning until lockers became available to freeze meat, vegetables, and wonderful strawberries. All the female relatives gathered in Mitchellville at the grandparents' home to preserve the various fruits from the orchard, as well as the strawberries, currants, boysenberries, and ground cherries. My mother, Esther Craig, Esther Craig Sutton, was a busy minister's wife in Boone, Iowa when I was growing up. She had few conveniences, but I always have had the house in order. She always had to have the house in order in the event a couple showed up to be married at the parsonage, or if someone needed counsel in the office, which was at the back of the house. Dad also had a huge garden, and all four of his kids shared in the work involved, especially in harvesting. The folks canned hundreds of quarts of vegetables and fruit. At the age of 12, one week I canned 300 quarts of tomatoes and peaches while Mom was visiting in Mitchellville. We all had to help with the house cleaning on Saturday mornings, so the living room would be in order for Sunday school class on Sunday. Mom played the pipe organ many Sundays, so it was my job to prepare Sunday dinner so it could be ready as soon as church was over. Everything was from scratch, and a special treat would be one of Mom's lemon pies for dessert. The welcome mat was always out, and guests often joined us for meals. In retrospect, I'm amazed at my mother's ability to prepare nutritious and varied meals on a pastor's low salary. She regularly listened to WOI radio from Ames at 10 a.m. Martha Duncan read menus and their associated recipes. To this day, I can see Mom sitting at the table writing these recipes as she listened. And I was thrilled to find her ledger book that she used to record these recipes. Some of those recipes are included in this cookbook. I sorted through two large recipe boxes to include many of her favorite recipes. Some of the recipes were from Mom's Aunt Ella Craig, who was the first graduate of Mitchell High School. She had no formal education, but was an avid reader, bird watcher, gardener, and an excellent cook and housekeeper for her two brothers. She and Mom bonded in Mom's infancy, and they were each other's favorite among the relatives. Auntie taught Mom the proper way to set the table, which was set with Haviland china each meal. Haviland. And all the extra plates and sauce dishes. I have wonderful memories of being a guest in her home for meals. I was disappointed when I was unable to resurrect her recipe for pineapple apricot pie to share with you. It was special. I hasten to say that none of us were particularly original or clever in our food preparation. Charles and Agnes Croce were personal friends from 1930 until their deaths in recent years. Agnes, Ag, was an excellent cook and was a baker at one of the dormitories at Iowa State University. She had a knack of looking at a recipe and knowing how it would taste. She was gorgeous in sharing these recipes with us, and I have included many of her recipes in the cookbook. She prepared cookies for every open house I held during my 40+ year of practice. Always the cheese bonbons and the strawberry cookies. You will find these recipes in the cookie section. In 1943, Mom moved us all to Des Moines so she could complete her college education. Dad had enlisted as a chaplain in the Army and volunteered for frontline duty in Africa and Italy. I did the cooking, Dr. Sally. My sister, Mary Grace, was in charge of house cleaning while my mom studied. My brothers also learned the basics of cooking, and Craig still does some cooking. His chili recipe is included. Okay, so you can see that this is misspelled. It says Greg, but it should be Craig. So I had to share that because how many 12-year-olds out there have prepared whole meals? We sometimes, I think in this day and age, we're so far removed from Earth that it is so convenient to go to the grocery store and not know where our food comes from. And Dr. Sally, I just think that she stayed healthy because she ate so well and everything was made from scratch. So she did get sick. Dr. Sally, when she was 10 or 11 years old, she had scarlet fever. She and her mother were quarantined to the second floor. Her father and brother served them what Dr. Sally, something that resembled food, up in the dumbwaiter. So the dumbwaiter was an elevator that would be in the kitchen and it would go up to the second floor. So there would be a tray of food that would be sent up there for she and her mom. And the family's physician would climb up a ladder on the outside of the house because they were quarantined. He would climb up this ladder, crawl through the second story window, and he would treat her. Now, scarlet fever is not fun. It's a bacterial illness that comes after a strep throat. So Dr. Sutton probably felt horrible. She had a rash maybe all over her face and tongue, and she had fever, and she has a very sore throat, and she has difficulty swallowing. Her glands in the neck and her lymph nodes are tender to touch. She might be vomiting, she might have nausea, and of course she might have a headache. And dear man of the physician's family, he came in to make sure she felt better. Now this was in 1938, 37, 38. And I can't tell you when antibiotics came along, but there's a high likelihood that this particular family physician did not have antibiotics with him. And there's a high likelihood that in 1937 and 38, that family physician ran around with one of these blood pressure cuffs. And in today's day and age, blood pressure cuffs are so electronic. But in those times when Dr. Sutton was young and doctors made house calls through the window, they would use a stethoscope and they would listen to how the blood pumped through the arteries and the veins. They would listen to how the air rattled around in the chest. They used this particular blood pressure cuff with a stethoscope in order to get a very detailed look inside the body before x-rays and before a lot of other tools were available. this was something that probably every doctor carried with them. So 13 years, 12 years later, Dr. Sally thinks, is so impressed, is such a good memory of this doctor, this family physician that helped her. This is what she decided to do. At 25 years of age, she was one of 2 female members of the class of 1953 at the medical school, Des Moines Still College of Osteopathy. Still is the last name of the man who founded osteopathy, A.T. Still. Now, this particular university is known as Des Moines Medical University now, and it's still practicing, it's still functioning. In the United States, doctors of osteopathic medicine are equals to medical doctors. In 1930s, 1940s, that was not true. There was a turf war between doctors of osteopathic medicine and MDs. Science takes a while to change, and Dr. Sally performed her osteopathy duties in the way that A.T. Still would be very proud of. She listened. She treated every person with dignity and respect. And she used her hands. And of course, she had other medicine. And if somebody needed an antibiotic, like I did once because of a chest infection, she wrote me a prescription for antibiotics. So she used regular medicine and prescriptions when they were needed, when manual therapies couldn't change or help the body as well as pharmaceuticals. But now it seems that most doctors are only using pharmaceuticals and very limited on hands-on. So Dr. Sally, she downplays that she was one of only 2 women in the graduating class. She said, I didn't mind the teasing, but I greatly resented the profanity spewed by my male classmates. So in 1953 in the United States, it was not a time well for women. There were no internships after school. There were no residency opportunities. So after she graduated, she borrowed her sister's car and she drove around northern Iowa to find a community that needed a doctor and had office space to rent. So she started her first practice November 1st, 1954 in Renwick, Iowa. She provided general care, obstetrics, and she delivered babies, emergency medical services, and more for more than 9 years. And that's where the next part of the story comes in. Ooh, it looks like we're going to have another part of the story soon. So we'll have a little bit of talk here about some of her clients that she saw in Renwick, Iowa. And then I will tell you a little bit about this. Well, I'll tell you about the smorgasbord now. But when Dr. Sutton was 87 years old, my daughter, me, and our friend from Sweden, Johan, he's single, ladies. Yeah. We made a Swedish birthday cake. This is very typical Swedish birthday cake. Those are tomatoes, and those are cucumbers, and those are grapes. And then rolled up here is turkey and rolled up ham with a little bit of parsley in there. And it's all on top of a cream, heavy whipping cream that has very little sugar. And it has white bread with tuna or ham, a ham salad in between. That's a Swedish birthday cake. It's not sweet, but it's delicious. So Dr. Sutton, at 87 years old, got her first Swedish birthday cake. So let's just read here about her extraordinary career and her patient care. She writes in page 5 of her cookbook, my first practice was in the small town of Renwick, Iowa. where I made wonderful friends who opened their homes to me. Rita Mae Rossman was the teacher of art, science, and home economics in Renwick, and she first stirred my imagination to try something different than meat and potatoes and gravy meals. Many of the recipes in the cookbook are from patients and friends in Renwick, as well as from Fort Dodge, where I moved after 10 years of family practice in Renwick. In those days, most all doctors made house calls. My schedule was busy, so the only time I had to make house calls was before office hours, breakfast time, the lunch hour, and after I closed the office, the dinner hour. I was baffled by the amount of arthritis, hypertension, and diabetes diagnosed by my patients. After a few months of house calls, as well as attending a few church potluck dinners, I concluded that the food these people ate must have something to do with their state of health. I especially observed that there were lots of desserts. I began taking nutritional histories on my patients and took an interest in counseling them on ways to improve their nutrition. The Harold Finch family was willing to grind wheat and cornmeal and switch their family farming operation to organic farming. I learned that health could be improved if people used whole grains instead of refined and processed flours. If they used natural sweeteners like honey, sorghum, and molasses instead of refined sugars like white powder and brown sugar. I thus began to experiment with recipes using only natural products. I especially enjoyed baking the whole wheat oatmeal bread from Finch's stone ground flour. Like all humans, I am not perfect. I have included many recipes that I would not recommend for daily consumption, but rather for special occasions. We each have our own individual health problems which require choices and elimination of food categories. You will need to decide which of my recipes are right for you on a regular basis and which ones will be for the occasional treat. In my practice, I found many patients who had loss of energy. Many of them had placed themselves on fat-free diets when their cholesterol was elevated. It was generally agreed that saturated fats have a negative impact on lipid metabolism, and most of us benefit from avoiding animal fat and saturated fat. However, just as we need essential amino acids daily, we also need essential fatty acids. These are found in nuts and seeds, as well as good quality oils such as canola, safflower, and peanut. These oils may be used in frying foods, in salad dressings, or as shortenings in cakes, pie crusts, and other baked goods. Many patients reported improved energy levels when they included good quality oils in their diet, at the same time reducing saturated fat. There is some controversy about the use of butter versus margarine. My preference is to use butter, which is fresh, frozen until ready to use. One cannot be sure of the type of oils or fats that are used in manufacture of margarine and whether they are fresh when processed. Each of you must make your choice in this regard. So I started eating butter. And to this day, I still eat butter because it has a special fatty acid in it called butyrate. And my gut bugs love butyrate. And it helps me with my mood. Okay, so Dr. Sally is an extraordinary woman, and she had an extraordinary career in patient care. I received my last treatment from her in 2014, but she said she practiced for 40 years, which would mean that technically she retired in 93, 94. But she had a limited practice of only osteopathy in her home for a number of years. And that's where I met her, in her home. And that was legal And I'm so glad it was because I have a new neck. Her experience from her childhood formed her. She helped form me, who I am today. My massage manual therapy practice would be completely different had I not met Dr. Sally. At the time, everything in massage therapy was muscle, 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 muscle. There was nothing about the fluid. There was nothing about the Vätska. There was nothing about something I came to know called the fascia. It was Dr. Sally that helped me discover this. So even if one is blind, being in a light like Dr. Sally, one that's around her and in her, you can see it. So even if you're blind, you can still see her light. It was amazing. And it probably still is. I just haven't seen her for a while. One could feel her integrity. And so I need to share with you an integrity story. This is Dr. Bennett Omalo, and I have his book here somewhere because I read it recently, several times. Yeah. So he wrote this book, and there was a movie called Concussion, also that was made into a movie. But truth doesn't have a side, and that's really what this is all about. Dr. Bennett Umalu put a name on something called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So it's a very difficult word for a lot of people. It's a pathology that happens in the brain. Chronic, over and over again. Traumatic is an injury. So of my 5 car accidents, 2 of them broke the windshield with my head. Most of them had whiplash. So Dr. Sally had a lot to do on me. I always remember the story because when she was in Renwick, Iowa, every Friday night in a small town in the Midwest, in Texas, wherever you're at in the United States, it used to be American football. And high school football was the thing. So in 1954, when she established her practice, she started doing physicals for the football players. She started seeing their families. She started seeing farmers and the farmers' families. And farmers don't take time off. And football players, high school football players, really didn't take time off either. It was their life. So she was announced to be the physician for the team. There was no pay. She got to sit on the bench every Friday out on the field. It was a highlight. She liked doing it. She loved doing it. She saw those boys grow up. And one of the boys was hit pretty hard with a concussion. And he lost consciousness on the field. He came to and he went to the sidelines and he told the coach, "Coach, I'm okay. I can go back in." And the coach, knowing that the game was really important and this particular player was crucial for the win, decided to put the boy back in. Dr. Sutton had told him before the decision, this boy should not go back in and play this game. This boy has been injured and he needs to rest. As a doctor, as a physician, she told the coach what he needed to hear, and he chose not to listen. And in that moment, Dr. Sally walked off the football field and never came back. And that coach asked more than once, and the players asked more than once. But her integrity was too strong because, as a physician, she knew that boy's life was important, not the game. So, Dr. Sally taught me lots of things. I get goosebumps talking about her. And there's this muscle energy technique that was made by Fred Mitchell Sr. in the 1960s. And the story goes, there's a long story with that. Fred Mitchell was an osteopath, and his son is 2 years younger than Dr. Sally. So his son was born in 1929, and in 1934, Dr. Fred Mitchell's son, Freddie Mitchell Jr., 50% of his body was burnt. He had third-degree burns over 50% of his body. And in 1934, that was a death sentence. There were not IVs. There was not a way for him to survive the night. So I know the story from Dr. Sutton. I will tell you because this is all about storytelling. Dr. Fred Mitchell worked on the docks in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He was a foreman. It was a very tough area. He carried a knife. The attending physician for his son said, "Your son will not make it through the night." And Fred Mitchell was not a doctor at this time. His son was very young. He worked on the docks in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He pushed that medical doctor up against the wall and he said with his knife, "If my son dies, there will also be problems for you. My family physician, the DO, Charles Owens, will come in. Even though he doesn't have hospital privileges, he will come in and sit with my son." And that is how Dr. Charles Owens helped Freddie Mitchell Jr. survive the night by doing Chapman's reflexes, by coming to his patient's aid, by doing manual medicine. And Dr. Sutton knows these stories because she spent a lot of time with Fred Mitchell Sr. because he had a technique that was light, that was easy, that was effective. And Dr. Sally had to know. She had farmers that they can't stay home, they can't call in sick. They have to be on the land and they don't have a 9-to-5 job. It's a constant job. A farmer needs to work. And it was Dr. Sally's job to get them working. So she learned muscle energy technique, but Fred Mitchell preferred muscular energy. It wasn't used, but it's a small little contraction against a therapist. And Dr. Sally used it, and I benefited from it. And it was the basis of A.T. Still's theory. It wasn't necessarily, it was a technique, but it was the idea that it was mechanical transduction. It was mechanical force put on the body so the body would make the decision to alter itself, to change, to adapt. And that's the most important because it's not, it was a philosophy. Let the body heal itself. And that's why this particular book, I read it from front to back, back to front. It was written by Judith O'Connell. She's a DOMHA. I don't know what that is. Fellow of the Academy of American Academy of Osteopathy. That's what FAAO means. And she wrote Bioelectric Fascial Activation and Release in 2000. It wasn't until I was really here in Sweden and the few times in the States that I opened it up and I read it and reread it and reread it. Oh my gosh, there's this whole thing called fascia. What have I been missing as a massage therapist only working with muscles? And this is what Dr. O'Connell says, what her osteopathy practice. Everywhere I went in the body, I was led back to fascia. I went back to reading Dr. Still, and behold, he too was drawn into the fascia as a place of life and death. The fascia proved to be the residence of the physician within, the patient that responded in health and disease. It is the intelligent tissue that interfaces with my intelligent palpation. Beautiful. One of these days, I'll show you that book. It's a little bit more black and blue than it is purple. But you know what? This guy, he wrote a book too, Paul Rennie, and I think he was a student of Dr. Sally Sutton's. And this is a technique book, pretty interesting. And as we've talked about, these are technique books. So that was Fred Mitchell Jr., the one that was burnt in 1934 and survived the night. He became a DO as well. And then his son Kai is a massage therapist that lives in Michigan. This is volume 1, and that's volume 2, and that's volume 3. And thank goodness, Dr. Sally got to know Fred Mitchell Sr. because she invited him and others to Fort Dodge for the first tutorial to say, I'm going to come into my house. I feed you, you teach, and let's figure out what you're doing so that I can do this with all of my patients. And had it not worked, and had they not figured out how they explain it, these wouldn't be here because it was Dr. Sally that put the wheel in motion. And she's the in-between. And I don't want history to forget her. She's pretty awesome. I think I've read this to you before. So this is A.T. Still, and he writes on page 62, it's a philosophy and principles of osteopathy. You know? Page 62, when you deal with the fascia, you are doing business with the branch offices of the brain. The doctor of medicine does effectually work through the medium of fascia. It says, why should you not relax, contract, stimulate, and clean the whole system of all diseases by that willing and sufficient power you possess to renovate all parts of the system from the deadly compounds that are generated on the account of delay and stagnation of fluids while in the fascia. And somehow we've forgotten. And this was available, but my mom never had it. So I got a little fire inside when I think about all the things that could have been. So come back again. Let's watch the Vätska, the wet stuff, the in-between part 2. And happy birthday, Dr. Sally. Be safe. You know,